How does an air source heat pump work?
Okay, so to explain that in full would take me ages, so I'm going to sort of really simplify it for the sake of this video. So essentially, most of us already have a heat pump, but we call it a freezer. So if you think about what your freezer's doing, you open the door. Inside, if you look, you can see some tubes, and it should be very cold if it's working well. You stick in a plate of food, shut the door, and it shouldn't be a big surprise. A couple of hours later, when you come back, that food is now frozen. So what's happened is the freezer has sucked the heat out of your food, and it goes into the little tubes. Inside the tubes is a refrigerant. Refrigerants are fantastic things. They're basically fluids which will absorb an enormous amount of heat. So the most common one you see in a fridge is actually propane, which is the stuff you drive your barbecue with. So when you're doing your barbecue, you may have noticed when you're running the barbecue, if you touch the gas bottle after an hour or so, it's freezing cold. It's boiling away. The propane's boiling away and sucking heat in to do that. So we use the same process in your freezer. So on the back of your freezer is a pump. We like to call it a compressor. It's a sort of buzzy thing at the back, at the bottom. And what that does is it takes the refrigerant, which is now full of all the heat out of your food, compresses it and kind of wrings the heat out of the refrigerant and dumps it out of a coil on the back of your freezer. So on your freezer at the back, there's a black coil, which if you touch it, you can feel is very warm. So then once it's dumped all the heat, back it goes inside again and round and round and round. So we don't use the refrigerant, we just recycle it again and again. So if you think kind of what your freezer's doing, it's taking heat from your food, it's sucking it into a refrigerant, compressing it with a pump, and then wringing that heat out and dumping it into your kitchen. So we could call your freezer a food to kitchen heat pump. And that's all it's doing. It's just using this refrigerant and changing its pressure to move heat from one place to the other. The machine I sell you and your air source heat pump is essentially doing the same thing, except we're cooling the garden instead of cooling your pizzas down. And we're, instead of wringing the heat out into a coil on the back, we wring it out into a heat exchanger which has water in it. The water takes the heat away and goes to your radiators and heats the house. So it's a process that everybody's familiar with. We've all got one. I like to ask people, when did you last have your freezer maintained? When did your freezer last break down? Your freezer, what temperature is it running at? -20. So people say, do heat pumps work in the cold? I always open the freezer door and go, yep, -20, still working. So that's it. That really, in a nutshell, very briefly, is how they work.